I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Caroline Stahala is Audubon, Florida's Seabird and Shorebird Program Manager for the Western Florida Panhandle. Her focus is on helping local municipalities implement seabird conservation measures, educating communities, and garnering support for local nesting and wintering seabirds. Caroline has been involved in various bird conservation programs for more than 20 years. She holds a Ph.D. in Ecology and Evolution from Florida State University, where she focused on the behavioral ecology of the Bahama Parrot on Abaco Island. Caroline also has experience working for national and international government organizations, such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, on bird-related issues. She has worked on conservation issues for a broad range of bird species, including Baird sparrows, woodpecker species, parrots, and seabirds. So Dr. Stahala, thank you so much for speaking to us this evening, and take it away.
Thanks, Carol. And so I have to do the obligatory question. What are you seeing on your screen, just to make sure?
I'm seeing the speaker's view.
Okay,
that's your presentation.
That's what I was worried about. So let me see if I can switch that around somehow.
Okay.
Does that help any?
Let's see. Yes, that's
yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect.
Oh, perfect. Very good. And I'm not sure if I answered your question before, but if you want to record the talk, I'm fine with that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
So I wanted to thank you all for having me. And Carol mentioned earlier on that because of COVID, that we're able to experiment with these Zoom features of having speakers that are not necessarily local. And so I'm grateful that because of this, I get to talk to you all because under other circumstances, I don't think I would have been able to. So thank you for having me. And as Carol mentioned, I have worked on various bird species over the past 20 years. Currently, I am focusing on primarily seabird and shorebird species. And we have our fill of them here in Florida. Obviously, we're surrounded by water, so we get our fair share, which is wonderful to see. So we are going to talk about the secret lives of seabirds. And that's mostly because they're so dependent on the ocean that we rarely get to see what's happening to them. And it's only those little glimpses when they do come to shore that we're able to appreciate them. So let's start off with just a very basic question. What is a seabird? What is it we're talking about here? So seabird doesn't fall nicely into one specific category. It actually crosses 4 different bird orders, and not all the species within those bird orders could be considered seabirds. And that's because we generally think of seabirds as these birds that are uniquely adapted to ocean or marine environments. And so they're dependent on the ocean for food, for living, for anything. Usually we only get to see them when they do come to shore and they nest on our beaches or islands or closer to the areas where people are found. Since they are dependent on the oceans, they are obviously foraging and feeding on species that are within the ocean, so marine invertebrates and fish species. And it's not just any fish species, but most individual seabird species have a specific fish species that they are dependent on. Finally, one of the unique characteristics of seabirds is that they really are fairly long-lived species. So with that, obviously we get to track them, we get to follow them over multiple years. And also it makes them a bit more sensitive when there are reproductive issues, and we may not actually see the effects of that for a longer period of time. So here, the pictures are just a quick look, a sample of what a seabird is. We have our wonderful albatross, which is one of the largest seabirds. There's just incredibly unique species. We have our charismatic puffins. You know, they just look like these little cartoon characters. They're unbelievable. And luckily, we have them here in the US, breeding further up our coast along the Gulf of Maine. If you ever have the opportunity, go see them. I highly recommend it. And then more locally, something that we're a little bit more familiar with are our least terns. A great example. They're also the smallest tern. So, you know, it gives you a bit of range of what a seabird is like. And then, of course, brown pelicans, a type of seabird that has made a great comeback. They were of incredible conservation concern due to DDT, and their populations crashed. And due to protective measures of the species themselves, as well as obviously the removal of DDT from general use, brown pelicans and other bird species that were impacted have made a great comeback. So our additional similarities within the seabird community, almost all of our seabird species nest colonially. So they tend to group into these incredibly large gatherings. Some of these sites are on islands, they can be on cliff faces, they can be on beaches, but basically they are nesting mostly on the ground or near the ground. Some of them build nests, so they bring in sticks and create these little pockets, nesting pockets. Others don't use any material at all, and they just dig a little scrape into the sand. So, but you will find them in large groups. And incredible thing is you will actually find them nesting with other bird species as well. So it's not just one individual bird species. I think in this picture that's evident. We have a number of different birds that are nesting or getting ready. Actually, these guys haven't started yet, but they're about to start. Because they are a long-lived species, they tend to have fewer chicks than a songbird would. There's this very general rule in biology that the smaller a species, whether it's bird or mammal, is, the more offspring they tend to have in any given year. But they're also shorter lived. So on the other spectrum, you have the very large species, like our albatross, that are much longer lived, but it also means they have fewer individual offspring on any given year. So you've got this spectrum. Of course, our least terns fall into, you know, having several chicks a year. They can have up to about 4 eggs in their clutch. And then you've got the albatrosses that usually only incubate 1 egg, and that's every other year. So it's a great example of how that rule works. And finally, within these nesting colonies, a nest will actually have both parents caring for those offspring. So you have the mom and dad, as very simply said, mom and dad caring for both the eggs and then the chicks. So biparental care, which is, it's not unique, but it is prevalent in seabirds. So I'd be remiss if I did not mention Wisdom, our long-lived Malaysian albatross. And apparently she's had another chick hatch this year. So earlier in January, I believe, her egg hatched. So what makes her unique is that she was banded. Scientists, biologists, keepers of the island have been able to track her over the past 70 or so years. And that she actually is. She's the oldest known bird alive right now. That doesn't mean that there aren't older birds, we just don't know of them. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there were other albatrosses that were even older than her, but I think it's incredible. I look for those messages from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service every year that talk about her return back to, I believe it's Midway Atoll. And so this gives us an opportunity to monitor and see what happens over the course of a breeding cycle for her. So we do know that it takes about 7 months to produce an offspring, and that's from laying the egg to the chick fledging. And then she will take the rest of the year and come back 1 year later. So it makes it basically a 2-year cycle. She may return back to the nesting site, but not actually lay eggs. So again, it's this great opportunity to see what happens. And so we will all keep our fingers crossed just to see, you know, how much longer can she go? It's absolutely fascinating. I look forward to it every year. So let's talk about some unique adaptations that seabirds have, because in order to deal with those ocean conditions, these birds really do need to be uniquely adapted to the situations. So let's go ahead and start with brown pelicans. We'll just take a few species. I wish I could get to every single seabird species, but unfortunately, I don't think we have the time for that. So we'll pick a few, talk about them, and maybe next time around we can pick a few more. But since brown pelicans have made such a comeback, and they are becoming more and more common along our coastal system, I'm getting more and more questions about them as well. And people do really enjoy watching pelicans either sitting on somebody's dock or on the pier, or flying in their little formations across the beach, and then finally watching them dive or forage. So seabirds have these unique adaptations, usually with their bills, for foraging and for targeting specific types of fish. And the brown pelicans are unique because they do have that pouch. I mean, that's probably the characteristic feature of pelicans is that pouch. And so people seem to think that they just sort of scoop the fish. So they do sort of scoop, but when they are actually diving into the water, and you can see it in this photo, I think this was one of those Audubon photo winners. So I took the opportunity to use it because it's amazing, and it shows exactly how these brown pelicans do dive. When they hit the water, their bills are actually closed. They don't open them until they're underwater, and that's when they will scoop fish. And then when they come back, they will slowly depress that pouch to let any water out. One interesting thing is you will find kleptoparasitism in these sorts of situations. So what that means is other, usually seabird species, will spend time near pelicans so that as they're finding food for themselves, any fish that come out of their pouch during the feeding process, these gulls will come in and snatch, any remaining fish. So these little opportunistic punks that take advantage of our poor pelicans. And it's not just pelicans. You will see that with other bird species too. Terns are notorious for stealing food from one another as well. But so our next bird species, and again, unique adaptation of their bill, is black skimmers. And I know you guys have black skimmers over in Jacksonville. Next summer, I hope you have the opportunity to watch them. They should be arriving in the area. If they're not already there, they should be arriving shortly. And their lower mandible is actually longer than their top mandible, which is unique to this species. Actually, I don't know of any other species that exhibits that morphological feature. And when they fish, they do exactly as their name says, and as it's shown in this photograph. They will actually skim the water until they hit a fish, and then they will close that bill and scoop it up and either eat it themselves or bring it back to their offspring to feed them. So there are already two unique ways of foraging. One is that scooping behavior by pelicans, and here is this skimming behavior by black skimmers. So here we're going to see another example of a different foraging behavior, and that is our least tern. And so the least terns, their bills are more pointy, so they're slightly more like the black skimmer, except they don't have the longer lower mandible. And that's because, again, they exhibit another feature of foraging behavior, which is that hovering and then diving behavior. So they will take the opportunity, they will fly around looking for fish. And when they see, and I'm not sure if they're looking for the fish themselves, if they can see it, or if they can see the fish bubbling on top. But when they, because I'm married to a fisherman, and I can tell you, he doesn't look for a fish, he looks for that little tail flip that happens when there's a fish in the neighborhood. So I suspect that's what least terns do, is they look for the behavior of a fish. So when they see something suspicious, they will hover, they will look around, and if they think that there's something in the area, they will then dive and they will catch fish underwater. And that is actually fairly typical within seabirds, is catching it underwater. And the perfect example of that is our puffin. And so the puffins actually do swim underwater. So before I move on to puffins, I did want to say one more thing about our least terns is, and since we're talking about behaviors, the least terns will fish, they'll catch their fish, and like the black skimmers, they may, consume it themselves or take it back to their offspring, or they will actually use that fish in a mating ritual. So it's a fairly common ritual, but it's kind of neat to watch. So if you're out on the beach and there are least terns around, just watch them. The males will come up and they will try to flirt with the females. She may just turn her back and walk away, and the males will try to pursue her. And every so often he'll get close enough to her where he can actually present the fish, but in the process of presenting, he will sort of slap her with a little fish. And it's just fun to watch. So bird behavior is fascinating. So if you get a chance this spring just to sit out on the beach and watch birds courting, it's fascinating. It's worth your time. But back to our puffins. So here we have a puffin swimming underwater. And the thing is, they actually do swim. So not only are they adapted bill-wise for foraging on fish and catching them underwater, but their wings are actually adapted as well so that they are swimming underwater. They actually use those wings as swimming propellants. So here we've got two features of adaptation to the marine environment. So we're verging on fish here. I mean, these birds are, they're taking it to a whole nother level. Typically, when you think of bird adaptations to the marine environment and wings, you tend to think of these long, skinny wings like albatrosses. That's kind of the classic example because the long, skinny wings make them absolutely amazing gliders. So when you're spending months and months and almost a year out on the water, having the ability to just glide obviously reduces the amount of energy you have to use to, you know, like other birds will flap. And since in most situations, there's really nothing out there over the water, you don't have to worry about hitting your wings against, like forest birds do, trees or a shrubbery or something in your way. But these guys have adapted their wings so that they can actually use them for swimming in the water, kind of like penguins. And penguins are a seabird also. I'm surprised I didn't use them as an example. But penguins, because they're now flightless, they use their wings for that swimming motion. So because they are ocean dwelling, I guess you could say, species, they encounter salt water on a regular basis. It's their home, actually. So how do they deal with that so that they can actually consume the water, but the salt itself doesn't impact their physiology? Well, it's actually really interesting because they have these salt glands that can extract salt out of the blood and then excrete it. And in one way or another, most birds have the ability to do that. They just don't need to. And then our seabirds, they have these, they've become overdeveloped systems which are used, you know, so that they can consume the water and excrete the salt and give them a percentage of salt content within their system that makes it suitable so that they can actually live. So here's an example of how that works. Thank you All About Birds for the image that I snagged from the internet, but it's the perfect example. It shows you how the water it's basically, or actually it's blood, it's not water that goes through the system, and it pulls it out and then it's excreted, and it usually looks like they have a runny nose, and that's just the salt coming out. Finally, I did mention earlier on that seabirds tend to be colonial nesting species. And so this is one sort of extreme example of that, and a beautiful extreme example. But it brings up two questions. One is, how do they find each other, and why? Why would they do this? So we'll talk about the why first. And that is primarily, it is thought that living in these large colonies allows aversion behaviors towards predators. So basically, it's protecting them from predators. And that seems to certainly be a big part of it, because we do see that as colonies become smaller, they are much more susceptible to failure because of predation. So there is some evidence for that, certainly. So these large colonies are incredibly important, and we tried to encourage larger colonies because they tend to be more successful. And so this is an extreme case of that. The second question I posed was, well, how do they find each other? And all birds have a limited sense of smell, at least. I know there's some idea about, well, how well do birds smell? So we don't know about every single species. We do know they do have those sensory receptors, so they're capable of smell. But there's some bird species that we know have at least a heightened sense of smell. And albatrosses, there are turkey vultures, or one of the vulture species, I think it's turkey vultures, certainly do have a heightened, thank you, Carol, I needed that, have a heightened sense of smell, and they use that sense, in their day-to-day lives. And albatrosses and other seabird species, I think there's some shearwaters that have been studied also, use that sense of smell to find their mates. And I think their offspring can actually identify the parents that way too. There's some vocalization components that are also being studied. So maybe between the two of those senses, they can make sure that that actually is mom or dad. So it's really interesting that it's not visual cues that identify individual, but smell and sound in some way. And I'm interested in looking more into that because, looking at this vast expanse of nests, it is amazing that they find each other. All right, so next we'll talk about seabird migration. And that's primarily because when we see seabirds, we tend to find them during their nesting periods. So we see them here. So most of their lives are not spent on our beaches, they are spent elsewhere. There's a few examples like our favorite gulls that maybe we do see them during most of their lifetime, but a lot of other species do spend most of their time over water, over the oceans, or going from one place to another. And that's actually the part of their lives we don't know very much about. And the photo on the right is sort of the classical way that we have been able to keep track of bird species, which is leg bands. Leg bands are becoming more and more sophisticated. And so, more numbers, more colors, so we can identify individuals, which is great. And it's low cost, relatively speaking. It's simple. Us backyard birders or scientists, it doesn't matter who can spot these birds, identify them, log them, send in our sightings to the bird banding lab. And that information then gets relayed back to the birder. So it's very simple, but very effective if those birds are resighted. Well, technology is improving, thank goodness. And we've gone from just leg bands to then some species, we could put radio transmitters on, which was sort of the next level of technology. And radio transmitters have their own issues. They were great if the birds stayed in the area because you could track them with a transmitter. But as soon as the birds moved out of the general study area, that's it. They were literally off our radar. So again, we were getting more information, but that information did end somewhere. Well, the latest and greatest technology, obviously, are little geolocators with GPS and much more sophisticated technology. And that was really limited only to larger species for a while. So larger mammal species, larger bird species, and that was really because of the amount of weight it required to put that on any sort of animal and then have any sort of duration. So it's usually the batteries that are the limiting factor. Well, again, as technology is improving, we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so the picture on the left-hand side is an Arctic tern that's been banded, and a little GPS transmitter has been placed on its leg. And some of its buddies were transmitted as well. And it's amazing the information that we've gotten from those. So not me personally, but the wonderful biologists that are in charge of this Arctic tern study. And so let's start with just the very basic. So we used to have to guess how far birds flew in any given year. So we used to think that we knew that the Arctic tern was the longest migrating bird species we had. So it flew the farthest every year. We knew that. Just, basically when you think of it going from one point to the other and then having to go back. So we estimated that an annual migration was somewhere in the neighborhood of 40,000 kilometers a year. Fair enough. I mean, that's a pretty good chunk of distance. Well, so then they put these transmitters on the birds, and what the scientists found out is we were nowhere close to that estimate. So on average, so here we have 11 different birds. So the green and the yellow and the red lines, they're different seasons, but these are 11 different birds. And so what the researchers found was that on average, and this is an average, so that means there were individuals that did more than this, they traveled about 89,000 kilometers every year. So that's double our estimate. And if you look at those lines, yes, they do spend some time in their breeding habitat, but then they are spending most of their time over ocean water. And you can see there's some spots that are super squiggly, and it basically looks like a solid colored patch on that map. And biologists did take a look at those areas to see what was unique about those. And there were some, it looked like those were high foraging areas. So those were areas that had certain fish species that those birds were going after. So these GPS transmitters are giving us so much information that we never knew about. And so I think it's going to rewrite how we understand bird migration. Again, because it doesn't require a person being there to record the number on the leg band, but we can see where these birds are even without any human presence in the area, which I think makes it actually more unique because birds aren't going to always be where we are. So just take a look at that. I think it's a neat representation of what these birds are doing. And I'm trying to see, the red is their wintering habitat. The yellow is their spring migration, and the green is their fall migration. And it looks like some of these birds split up and went to different places, but in general, they do tend to use certain parts of the ocean more so than other areas. So that just shows you they're spending so much more time over the water than we could have even imagined. So we've talked a little bit about threats, but let's get more into it. So what are seabirds facing these days that are impacting their population sizes? I mean, we know seabird populations are crashing, and we know that. So on the next slide, I have some pictures of the impacts of plastics, but plastics in our oceans are a problem. And some of these birds see it as food. They bring it back to their chicks. The chicks are starving because they're eating something that's not digestible. Fishing lines along the shoreline are, I mean, I can't overstate the impacts, because we do beach cleanups every year before the nesting season in nesting areas. By the end of the season, inevitably, we have 1 or 2 birds that die because they've been wrapped up in fishing line. And that we know of. So that's, you know, something that's come back to the nesting site, or that they found somewhere else and brought back. Excuse me. So changes in fish species and fish abundance. And this is primarily due to, well, 2 reasons. One is climate change. And for example, the Gulf of Maine has increased in temperature, and we're seeing that in how puffins are having to respond to the changes in fish species. So puffins have a preferred fish species, and those fish are now found deeper and farther out. So puffins are having to fly further, or they're having to swim deeper to get those fish species. So it is more energy that they're having to expend. And the example of this puffin, you can see it has sort of a rounded, I think they call them butterfish. And when it brings that back to the chicks can't eat it because they're just too big. Excuse me. Habitat loss, a great example of that was recently, we saw the Hampton Roads project in Virginia, where they were basically paving over a known seabird colony without any repercussions. So initially they weren't forced to either relocate the colony or avoid the colony in the first place. I think towards the end, because of the backlash of wonderful people around the country who love their birds, they did come up with a plan to relocate the colony. But that's just a very public example of that, but smaller examples are happening around the country every single day. So, you know, let your voices be heard when there are impacts to seabird nesting colonies that we need to either mitigate or find some way around those sites. And I'm even up for figuring out how to create artificial nesting habitats in certain places. That is happening more and more. And then just general disturbance. These birds can be fairly sensitive to both human disturbance or, you know, having dogs in the area, having any domesticated animals. And I'm not even talking about predators at this point. We're, you know, just talking about just animals that we bring in. And so being respectful of areas that are posted for no dogs, it's not meant, you know, to dissuade you from taking your dog on a walk somewhere. But, you know, if we can have these areas for birds, because they see dogs as predators. So they will expend energy trying to dive bomb you, which I'm sure you have experienced at some point, or defending their nests and chicks. And that's energy that they could be using for other things, especially as fish species are declining and changing. You know, they just don't have that energy to expend. So, you know, just please encourage anyone you know to, you know, respect posted bird areas. So how can you help? Well, I wanted to add these pictures because I didn't have space on the previous slide. We are seeing more and more impacts of these lines, the fishing lines. It's just getting caught on their legs, they're swallowing things, they're getting wrapped up in them. We regularly have hooks and wings that I mean, those are easy to take out if you can catch the bird. But it happens so frequently, you wonder, you know, how many are you not seeing? And then, of course, the plastic issues. And there have been plenty of stories and reports about doing necropsies on chicks at nest sites, showing just the consumption of plastic in those areas. Well, since these birds are dependent on our oceans, please advocate for clean oceans policies. So not only does that benefit the fish and the marine mammals that are in the oceans, and I mean, of course, us too, because we enjoy clean shorelines, nutrient-free rivers flowing into our ocean bodies. But it does help our seabirds as well, because they are dependent on food from the oceans and a clean environment as well. Educate others about ocean-friendly practices, which then hopefully turn into bird-friendly practices as well. Whether that's, you know, just telling people not to walk their dogs right past the shorebird or seabird colony, or walk through a colony on their own, or just tell them, you know, cool little story about the least tern bringing a fish and, you know, sharing it with their mate. I think we all love birds because we know these little tidbits, and the more we can share that with people around us, I think the better the birds are off. And then I think you guys are already doing it, joining local groups and, you know, advocating for things to happen locally. You can make a difference. And I really didn't want to end on threats. So let's talk about your local seabirds. I always feel like I end up kind of on a down note, and I don't want to do that. So you guys have some really cool seabirds along your coastline. And you have some fabulous state parks and I think there's national seashores, if I'm not mistaken, that have seabird colonies and shorebird colonies on them. And just as an example, we have here I have an example of a Bonaparte's gull, but you guys have, I mean, even laughing gulls, as long as you don't feed the laughing gulls, they can be really neat to watch. Brown pelicans, again, they've made a fabulous comeback. So really appreciate those birds, the pelicans that are in your area. Black skimmers, you guys have black skimmer colonies every summer, and those black skimmer colonies do need a bit of help. We do have a stewardship program, so I'll tell you about that in a little bit. And they usually have the least terns with them as well. There's nothing cuter than a loose tern baby chick. And so if you have an opportunity to go out and steward a site, hopefully you get to see a little downy baby least tern. And inevitably mom or dad will come and bring it a fish to eat. And you better have your camera ready on that one. Royal terns, we've got royal terns and sandwich terns that nest in certain areas. So I don't know specifically in the Jacksonville area, but I know they are all along our Florida coastline, so I wouldn't be surprised. But in addition to all those other ways you can help, Audubon, Florida does have an advocacy representative over there, Chris Farrell. So he doesn't have as much time as I do to help out with monitoring beaches. He's usually involved in more of the water quality issues. So he's helping from another aspect. But if you are interested in going out and helping with some stewardship activities, please contact Chris Farrell and he will put you to work. So he knows where all the local colonies are, and he's more than happy to send you guys out there. And during the middle of the summer, it can be hot. So if you want to pick your times on when you want to go out, that's perfectly all right. Right now, our stewardship program still isn't to full capacity because of COVID. So there's probably more monitoring opportunities, but still, as things open up here a bit more, I'm sure they're itching to have more people help out. So give him a call, send him an email, tell him I sent you. And that's it for my presentation, but I am excited to answer any questions you may have.
Well, the first question that I want to, or the first thing that I would like you to address, hang on, sorry, is could you go back to that slide?
Absolutely, yep.
The black skimmer on the beach. I think that's an interesting photo over in
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you talk a little more about that?
Yes. And you are seeing the slideshow, right?
Yep.
I don't have.
No, you don't have to bring it back up again. I can see that.
Okay.
I don't know if everybody can see that picture. It's laying on the beach.
Yeah, right here, this little guy. And you're absolutely right. I'm glad you mentioned it because we regularly get calls from people saying there are dead skimmers on the beach. Right. Black skimmers actually exhibit this behavior out on the beaches where they lay themselves flat out. And sometimes even their wings are slightly out. So it really does look like a dead bird. But then every so often you'll see them lift their heads up and you know that they're okay. But and I think it's a cooling mechanism. The sand, so as much body area as they can, laying it flat on the sand is cooling to them. So yeah, don't worry about that. They're okay. But yeah, you do see it, and it's kind of neat.
So we do have a couple of questions so far. So I'm going to go ahead and just go in the order that they came in.
Sure.
That initial pelican photo of the pelican diving into the water, Kate wanted to know, do pelicans normally dive with their necks twisted around like that, or is it just kind of an unusual photo? Yeah, that's the one.
I think so this is his belly, here are his feet, and this is the bottom of the mandible. And it looks like the pouch is sort of off to the side because you can see the hook on the end of the bill right there. So this is basically just the underside of the pelican.
Got it.
So I think it's just the speed that he's going at. The pouch is kind of like, yeah,
knocked over or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So Sarah asked, where do these seabirds nest in Jacksonville and when? And the question came in when you were specifically talking about the black skimmers, but of course we have other seabirds that nest in our area as well. Do you want to address that?
I can, and
I do know a little bit about it.
Okay, you may know better. I know a couple of, I think Anastasia State Park is one of the nesting sites, and I know there are other state parks and national seashores. Whether I can name them off the top of my head, I think you're going to be better at that.
So let me jump in on that one. So Big Talbot and Little Talbot State Park on the north side of the St. Johns River is a nesting site for, I believe, some least terns, but not as many least terns nest there. potentially some black skimmers, potentially American oyster catchers, laughing gulls, and royal terns. I don't know that I can name all of the seabirds that nest there. And then there's also some shorebirds like Wilson's plovers and I can't remember.
Snowy plovers, maybe?
We don't get snowy plovers nesting here that I know of. And then, of course, Huguenot Memorial Park is one of the largest, as far as my understanding, is one of the largest nesting colonies of laughing gulls and royal terns on the eastern coast. One of the largest, not necessarily the largest. And like you mentioned, Anastasia State Park, definitely. So those are the major ones that I know of. I know that least terns typically nest a little bit further south of us. And not to say that we don't have any here in Northeast Florida, but more of them nest a little bit further south and even on some pebble rooftops in the Palm Coast area and south of St. Augustine. So that's pretty much all I know. Did you want to add anything else to that, Caroline? I'm not certain.
Yeah, and so the other opportunity for helping out with shorebird and seabird monitoring is if you don't feel comfortable going out on the beaches when it's hot, and you can help out with the rooftop sites because they are looking for monitors to go out and keep an eye on those sites. So, contact Chris, he can point you in the right direction.
Indeed. So we did get another question. Karen wanted to know if the nesting sites are monitored and whether people are kept a safe distance away. And I guess, Karen, are you talking about the Northeast Florida nesting sites or all of them? Caroline can probably talk more about that.
Yeah, let's talk regionally first, and then maybe
there you go.
Spread out. So regionally, Florida-wise, we try to monitor either ourselves or with partners as many sites as we know of. So if we know that there's a large nesting colony, we're on top of it in one way or another. So the nesting sites in your region, we do have a seasonal technician that we hire every year that does help out with that. And what Audubon generally does is when we identify a nesting site, so a lot of these birds are actually protected by state law. So you really aren't supposed to be interfering with their nesting behavior, but obviously with their on the ground nesting, it's for the general public, they just don't know that that's what's happening. So what we do is we send out our volunteers and staff to help post the sites. We have official FWC posting that we put out that has all the legal language on how these birds are protected. And we will then have either staff or volunteers go out and monitor. So, make sure that everything's okay, but then also to steward. And that means basically doing educational outreach with the beach-going public. And that educational component, again, they learn little tidbits about it, and those birds end up being safer and more successful, actually, we've found out. So yes, locally, they are protected both legally and by Audubon, where we put out posting. But then worldwide, more and more sites are being protected too.
And it's my understanding, Caroline, that at least this is what Chris told me recently, a couple of weeks ago, that Audubon is hiring some positions called Coastal Bird Steward Anchor, I remember, at Little Talbot Island State Park, as well as, I believe, Anastasia Island State Park. And these are folks who kind of run the Shorebird stewarding program.
Exactly.
I don't have any specific information yet about those positions, whether they've been posted or advertised.
Yep.
That typically starts, I believe the stewarding typically in our area typically starts around Memorial Day and goes through the end of, I think, middle of August or end of July, something like that.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
It's very similar with here in the Panhandle.
Right,
as well.
right. And then Huguenot Memorial Park has its own program that's connected to the Audubon Florida program, but run by the Huguenot Memorial Park staff naturalists. Yeah. So we will certainly share information about those programs as soon as I get that information, but it's a little early days yet on that, so we don't have
and usually Chris is in the loop on all those things. Yes. So if you have questions, just ask him, he'll know.
Exactly. We do have another question from Laura. She says, are there any diseases that have been detrimental to seabird populations because they nest in colonies?
So yes, and that's actually one of the characteristics that we're always amazed by. Nesting in a colony, you would think that diseases would run rampant, and they do. And usually that's when the birds are already impacted in some way. So if they're, if they're not finding enough food, so there's some sort of underlying issue already, they're more susceptible to diseases. And that's when we see impacts to entire nesting colonies. So we definitely keep an eye out on that, and we collect dead birds and send them off for pathology when we find that. Yeah.
I don't see any other questions in the chat, and I was just checking our Facebook page. I don't see any questions coming in on our Facebook page either. Let me make sure. Hang on. So Karen says that Karen is in South Florida, and she says they have a stewardship program going on Marco Island.
Yes.
And there's an intern that apparently is working with them on that. So it's good.
So Karen, you're working with Adam down there, I think?
Yes, sorry, I couldn't unmute. I volunteered to do it once, but he did a program recently, and I know it, and I'm pretty sure when I did it, there were signs, and we were talking to people, so I think it's grown since then.
Yeah. Yes. And so you get those skimmers year round down there, which I'm jealous of. My skimmers migrate, they leave, and they come back for the summer. But you've got individuals that have stayed.
You're right. I haven't been to the beach because of COVID, so it's been a long time. But hopefully I'll get back this summer.
Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. I don't know that there's any other questions. I think we're done. Does anybody have any other questions for Caroline? I don't see anything else.
Well, and you guys have my contact information, so if anything comes up, just let me know.
Exactly. Well, everyone's commenting how wonderful and fascinating this program was. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being here with us this evening, and everyone for joining us tonight for such a fabulous program. This will be available on our Facebook page as well if anybody missed it and wants to come and take a look at it again. And I think I will also post it on our YouTube channel as well. In case anyone wants to refer back to it, but just an absolutely fascinating presentation and wonderful information. I always think, oh, I know so much about seabirds, and it turns out no. I always learn so much when I
do too.
Come to these programs. So it's very, very good. Well, thank you again for being here. We truly appreciate it, and I hope everyone has a lovely evening.
Nice seeing everyone.
Good night.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.